Thanks very much. Look, my chapter in this book is about the public service. Now, I have to confess, I have worked in the public service, and I did work, by the way. It wasn't just my feet up watching listening to horse races or things like that. And I'm just going to give you a bit of a background. My overall view, which you may not agree with, is overall we've been served well by our public service. Okay, overall, and I'll give you some minuses as we go on. But my basic little thesis, I suppose, is unless you've got a good, competent, apolitical, expert public service, you can't do a lot of things in society. You can't run things properly. And we're lucky, when Australia was first founded or colonised, if you like, we inherited the British public service, which at that time was fairly incompetent. This is in the 19th century. You know, this is when you used to be able to buy a position in the army. Okay, you know, if you're a lord and you had a useless son, you'd buy him a position and hope he sends off and hope he doesn't kill too many people in the process.
Isn't that the goal of an army?
Okay, yeah, well, yeah, but killed his own men is the trouble. And then the Navy, while the British Navy is always called the senior service, that in the British Navy you had to pass an exam. That is, you had to sail the ship back. The Admiralty liked you to not just go out, but also come back, because ships were expensive things. So, you know, Captain Cook and all those sort of people all had to pass exams, and so the captain of the ship tended to be fairly competent. I mean, Captain Bligh was a brilliant sailor, maybe not a great governor, but he had a different system. Now, so when Australia was being formed, colonies being established all around Australia, our public bureaucracy was, only moderately competent in a sense. We were inheriting the British model, which at that time was undergoing change. The big change in Britain was the Crimea War, the charge of the Light Brigade, where you had the useless officers making very silly mistakes. And after that, a couple of people in British Treasury called Northcott and Trevelyan did a review and said, you know, maybe we need to change the way we do things. Maybe we need to employ people with an exam before they take a position. Maybe we should only promote people after they've proved they can do things. And this gradually filtered through. By the way, the Prussians were there before them. That's why Prussia kept beating everyone in all the wars, okay? So that's another story. So Australia developed that, and in the 19th century, as our states were being formed, our colonies were being formed in the states, we had lots of royal commissions into the public service, and that led to the idea of an independent public service, the Westminster model, if you like, of the public service. That is, that the public service, you got recruited on an exam, you got promoted on merit, you were apolitical. When the governments changed, the public service stayed, and you gave what used to be called frank and fearless advice. That is, Minister, that really isn't a good idea. Okay, right? Now, and that's really served us very well. Under Prime Ministers like Menzies, basically he liked public servants to be very competent and to tell him like it is. Now, this is all going along rather swimmingly, but like most things in Australia that started to get stuffed up, it all goes back to the Whitlam government. Okay, so I'm sorry to say that, son. The Whitlam government, to me, did a lot of things wrong. It seemed to do a lot of harm to my family, since my family was in the building and retail trade at the time. The Whitlam government was the big watershed in Australian politics and Australian public administration. So up till then, you used to have permanent heads of departments who were permanent. And some of the brilliant permanent heads who led Australia after World War II, and they were the ones who would tell the ministers the truth. Okay? And that stopped Australia doing a lot of stupid things. We still did some silly things because politicians will be politicians, right? And they were called the Seven Dwarfs, the very famous heads of Treasury and heads of different departments. With Whitlam, Whitlam came to power after 23 years of non-Labor government. So he regarded the public service as very suspicious. And he began the big change in the public service. Firstly, the Commonwealth government got involved in lots and lots of new areas, okay, which weren't, and therefore the Commonwealth public service grew dramatically. He saw the public service as being the pace setter for wages and conditions. Okay, so we went to 4 weeks leave, 7.5% loading, leave, parental leave, all those things started to happen at that time. The second thing he did, he basically began the ending of permanent department heads. And one of the first people he appointed was Dr. Peter Walensky, who was on his staff, and John Menadue, who was on his staff. John Menadue became head of Prime Ministers. Manager Walensky became head of, I think, the media department. Another guy called Spiegelman, who was on his staff, all got appointed department heads. So you broke that nexus between, and the idea of being a permanent public servant means you can say something to a minister and they can't sack you. That's the great virtue of it. I mean, I don't mean public servants should have a job for life, but when you're giving advice, if you know that you can't be sacked, that helps you give strong advice and sometimes correct advice. So that started to change, and the public service started growing. The second big change that started to happen was the growth in ministerial staff. Now, I have to admit, I was a senior private secretary to the Minister for Immigration in the Fraser government. We had 5 staff, including me. I was the head of office and the press secretary. We had 3 typists and 1 other person. These days, that office would have 15 staff, right? 15. And so Whitlam began the idea of bringing in people from outside the public service, outside the normal recruitment system, and putting them in ministerial offices, and also putting them into government departments. Now, it doesn't take much of a bright person to work out these people were Labor-orientated people, okay? They were mates and friends and so on. Now, this is the beginning of the end of the Westminster sort of idea of an independent, neutral, apolitical public service. Unfortunately, those trends continued no matter who else was in office. Malcolm Fraser didn't change that particularly. He got rid of the Labor people and put in some other people, but you had the end of the idea that a public service and a public servant was there to give this sort of advice. So a very big change. And this all happened around the state level too. Now, I know some of my left of centre academic friends don't like this, but under the Bjelke-Petersen government, strangely enough, we actually had a Westminster public service. I worked in that system, okay? So you had Leo Hilcher of Treasury, who would say, well, Mr. Premier, you can't spend that money, right? Okay? And you had other people who ran Coordinator General's Department. They were career public servants. They knew their stuff. When you went and had a meeting with them, they knew their stuff. When Goss came in, that changed. Okay, we had people being brought in from universities. No disrespect, Jim, being heads of department, and they were followers. They were what I call camp followers to the system. So this is one of the things that's happened. So what's been happening in our public service, and when I rejoined the public service again in 98-99, so you've had all the permanent heads are no longer permanent. They're all on 5-year contracts. All the senior ranks next down, all the senior executive service, they're all on contracts, okay? And there's also the public service board that used to protect things, that's all gone. So there's more partisan appointments being appointed down the line, if you like, right? Okay, so this is a very important process. So several consequences. One, the public service is becoming more political. Now, as a public servant, of course, you're aware of politics. I had to brief a minister once in the Beattie government, and he said, Scott, can you fix that? I certainly can, Minister. But Minister, I have to warn you, to fix it, there's going to be a bit of flack. He said, oh, I don't want any flack. I want you to fix it. And there'd be no political flack. I said, well, Minister, I can't fix it because it's going to cause someone to lose something. And if we don't fix it, it's going to come back and bite you. And he said, but what about the politics, Scott? I said, well, Minister, I'm here to talk about the policy. You get the big bucks to do the politics, okay? It's over to you, Adi, okay? So ministers don't want it to be upset the apple cart, and so that's what happens. So our public service has become more political. The second consequence is public service is no longer giving the strong, courageous advice that they used to, because their jobs depend on pleasing the minister. They're now appointed by the minister. This happens federally as well, okay? Happens federally as well. And therefore, you've got a different game going on to what it was 30 or 40 years ago. The third consequence of what's happening is you've got this constant restructuring of departments, okay? Now, I'm a conservative, so I don't like restructuring just for the sake of restructuring, and I've been in a department which was getting restructured, and believe it or don't, for 6 months we had no work. That is, the whole department was getting restructured. We didn't know what our positions were, and we finally had a big meeting. This is after the Beattie government came in. A big meeting of the new Labor-appointed head of department, and there was a guy who was resigning that day. He was retiring, and he got up and said, "Can you please tell us when we're going to have some work to do?" Right? And that sort of got some action. So restructuring, this constantly restructuring going on in the name of reform is another problem. So there's some problems. The other problem happening, because of now you've got, every time there's a change of government, there's a change of senior people. Okay? Now this means, one of the things the bureaucracy used to be good at was memory, you know, because people had been there. They could tell you where all the bodies were buried or the files were, what had happened, and so on. And so what has happened, the public service now suffers from amnesia, right? They don't know what they did before. You know, the smart state idea, you know, Beattie was on about the smart state. I hate to tell Mr. Beattie, it was tried before. Was it? Yes, it was, okay? It's not a new idea, Peter, I'm sorry. So what you've got now, because of all the churning of positions, all the political appointments coming in, all the people from outside, the public service has lost its memory. It doesn't know what it did, okay? And doesn't know what it didn't work before. So I'll give you one example. I had a couple of people in my branch. One of these guys had 8 boxes of files with him. Wherever he went, he had 8 boxes of files. He'd been in the public service 25 years. He knew where everything was. And I remember getting rung up by the head of the Premier's department and said, "Scott, I suppose you wouldn't know, would you, about such and such a project?" I said, "I think we might." I asked my staff member, Peter, "If you know such and such?" He had the file. He had the file. And I said to the Director General, "It has been tried before, Director General, it didn't work." Okay? So the public service has lost its memory about doing these things, okay? And it's so busy trying to meet diversity targets and other targets and so on, it's forgot what its job is. It's forgot what its job is to do. And the other thing is the anti-corruption type bodies create another load of things. Then you've got the different quotas for different things coming in. And I don't want to attack women. Some of my best friends are women, so I don't want to do that. But as a sort of a middle-level public servant, we often had a woman being appointed in a senior position, in an acting position, so that she could then apply for a position because she served in an acting position. Are you with me? And so it's part of the game that was going on. So there's some of the problems that have happened. The other problem that's happened, and this has happened federally, and you're seeing it all the time in the bad policy that's coming out of Canberra land. I call Canberra land. It's sort of like Santa land in a way. And I'm not the only one who says this. People like Gary Banks says this, who used to run the Productivity Commission. And I worked for senior federal ministers in Canberra, right? And what I found, one of the things I found very strange, the public service has lost its analytical ability, all right? So I'm not saying they're all lazy. So you get, something would happen, or someone would write a report, or some university person, and I'd send it to the department. What do you think of this? You know, what do you think? Give me your analysis. And the analysis I got back was often of very poor quality. I mean, is that the best you can do? Really? Okay. And so I used to use a lot of outside people, confidentially, and send them things. What do you think of this? And I'd get much better analysis from some of my contacts and people. Because I used to tell public servants, just tell me the truth. Don't tell me that you think I'm a right-wing fascist or whatever. Just tell me what you think, okay?
They could both be true.
No?
They could both be true.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So that was one of the problems has been the public service has gradually lost its memory, it's lost its skills, it's lost its analytical ability. And this is affecting, so ministers are now over and over again getting what they want rather than what they need. Now, I'll give you one example, which is a true example. When I worked for Mr. Beattie's department, Mr. Beattie was going overseas. My job, well, I ran a branch called International Collaborations, and my job was to check anything he was going to sign overseas. You know, one of those agreements, you know, they sign when they go overseas, an MOU. Now, we all know they do that for symbolic purposes to justify the trip. We know that. My job was to make sure he does no harm when he signs an agreement. The Trade Division had come up with this agreement to sign with a firm in Los Angeles, okay? And I just said to the Trade Division head, has anyone checked out the firm? Oh, no, Scott. Well, look, I think we might, my branch might just check out the firm. So we checked out the firm, not very hard task to do, and we discovered that two things. It was sort of questionable viability, and secondly, there was a Brisbane firm who did the same thing, right? So why are we signing an agreement with an American firm that may be not viable? So I told the trade guy, I'm not going to do a joint brief with you. I'm going to join a brief to the Premier not to sign the document, or warning him. Oh, Scott, you can't do that. He needs this agreement to sign to justify the trip to Los Angeles, where it was, okay? I said, well, look, I don't care. I'm sending it up the line, and then the Premier or the Premier's office can decide what they want to do. So it caused quite a lot of hassle, as you can imagine, because I'm going against the conventional wisdom. So my brief went up. Here's all the details. It didn't say don't sign, it just said saying, be aware of these problems if you sign this agreement. To me, I'm saving the taxpayer money, okay? It did go up. I got a call from the Director General. Come up and have a talk to me, please. Explain, right, okay, no, I understand what you're saying. And Mr. Beattie did go overseas. He did take his Director General with him. Mr. Beattie didn't sign the agreement. His Director General did. Right? Okay. And guess what? It did blow up. Okay. It did cause a problem, but because the Director General had signed it, it didn't cause the flack. Right? This is an example of giving the frank and fearless advice. But had I gone along with the trade head, I would have just signed the agreement, no problems, go ahead with it. And unfortunately, this happens too often. And when I was working in Canberra, one of my jobs was when I was talking to the department people to come up and brief the minister. For goodness sake, please put up option 3, you know, saying this is a stupid idea. Oh, Scott, do you think so? Yes, he's got to hear it's a stupid idea. And if he still wants to go ahead with the stupid idea, on his head be it. But at least you've told him it's a stupid idea, right? So that's one of the problems we've got with the public service. We've also got the fact that, you know, people are coming and going, and it's become a place now where locate your mates and so on. Now, unfortunately, this happens on both sides of politics. The LNP government, but dare I say it, your party, under Mr Newman, did all the things wrong. Did all the things wrong about getting into office. You know, the way he appointed all his friends from the Brisbane City Council, people who had been vice presidents of the Liberal Party or whatever, or candidates, all the things wrong. Instead of saying, let's start again, let's try and get back to a Westminster system, let's try and have a public service based on merit, on ability, on careers, and let's set an example to those other mob. The LNP side just aped, if you like, what the other mob was doing. You know, that's one thing. Now, if you're a bit of a pessimist, you might say the reason why public ministers or politicians spend so much time about restructuring the public service and those things is because in our globalised world they can't do much else, okay? Because they're stuck in this sort of process whereby we've got to respond to international pressures and so on and so forth. So what do politicians like to do? Activity. They love activity, okay? Anything. Signing useless agreements, opening, cutting ribbons, making speeches that no one believes in, and so on and so forth, activity. So these are real problems. You know, I find it really amazing in this COVID times, and I'm with you on all these things, that we've had now over a year and a half, I think, of emergency powers.
Yes, disgusting.
It's really quite extraordinary, isn't it? A year and a half based on health emergency powers, and you might notice that Parliament doesn't sit very often. Okay. Now state parliaments in Australia, unlike state parliaments in America, don't sit that much, even in the best of times. It's about 60 days or something like that. We're down to about 30 days if we're lucky, and last year the federal parliament passed all this money in a day. So forget about the scrutiny and so on that's going on. So it's very interesting how the National Party used to get a lot of criticism about Parliament, but I don't hear anyone from Griffith University making too many comments about the lack of sitting of Parliament. And since I think Parliament's a pretty important place, it's quite extraordinary. So there are some problems we've got about the public service. The public service, there is a lot of dedicated people who do try and work in the public service and do try to make things happen and do try and go the extra mile, but we've lost a merit-based public service, just like we've lost a merit-based education system, okay? Over-concerned about equity and inclusion. It's no use being inclusive if people still can't read, okay, right? There's 100,000 kids by grade 9 can't read properly, okay? That's it. I think that's rather important. That might be important to do it. And in Queensland, one of the other problems, and I'll finish up on this, the other thing that's happened is the immense growth of the public service, especially in the last few years. The public service is the largest employer in Queensland. Think about it. Think about it. And it's highly decentralised. Yeah, and so, and I think there's been a really important change in our society. We've de-industrialised because we've gone too much down the globalised route, okay? Now, I'm in favour of, free trade or so, but not at our own expense, okay? Let's a bit of self-interest first. So therefore, the unions that used to be with manufacturers and men, the main unions today are nurses' union and teachers' unions, right? Who are in public service, who are in them, okay? So that's what's driving the Labor Party to that sort of structure. So that's one of the factors. So the Labor Party is always trying to meet those things about meeting things. So, teacher unions, what do teacher unions all want? Smaller classes, and by the way, there's no correlation between small classes and performance, and more spending on something else and something else and something else. So we keep going on that track. But the real problem, you can't address the problems in society unless we get back to a proper career, merit-based, efficient public service that doesn't see itself as an end in its own right, but is there to carry out the wishes of the electorate and the elected governments. So then I'm finished. Thank you.